Hey, good evening. It's nice to be back here in the church library and teaching again here. It's just this good place to be for me. We've been talking about spiritual growth, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And give you a couple of things that I say almost every time, so hopefully you'll remember this. Number one, spiritual growth is not optional. And I'll give you a verse if you're taking notes, and I hope you are. The neat thing is, if you need to go get something, you can always hit the pause button, and so I think that's a neat thing. Anyway, spiritual growth is not optional. John 15:2 says that whoever doesn't bear fruit, if the vine doesn't, or if the branches don't bear fruit, that the husbandman will take them away. So there are problems. It's not an optional thing. It's not okay. I'm a saved now. I can grow spiritually or not. It doesn't matter. It matters a lot. The second thing I would say is that spiritual growth is not natural. It's not something that we can do on our own. It's something that the whole point, oh my goodness, think about this. The whole point of this whole enterprise of God is for us to have a relationship with God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. That's what salvation is. That's what spiritual life is. That's what heaven will be as well. So, wouldn't it be just like God to do this in such a way that if we're going to grow spiritually, it has to be a joint effort? And that's exactly what God has done. God has predestined our spiritual growth. Think about that, Romans 8:28 through 30, that we are predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Here again, relationship. And God has also promised our spiritual growth, and there's plenty of places in Scripture. Romans, I'm thinking about, of course, our verse that we've been talking about, 1 Thessalonians 5:23. God is faithful and he will do it. The one who has called you is faithful and he will do it. 2 Corinthians 3:18 we've talked about. I love that, where it says that we are being transformed one step at a time by the Holy Spirit who is inside of us. So spiritual growth is not optional. It is not natural. That having been said, think about this. The ultimate teacher for our spiritual growth is an omnipotent. Now think about this. This is helping me. You'll get there, I hope. But for me in studying this, it's helpful. We have a teacher who is committed, and I mean committed, to our spiritual growth to become like Christ. He is omnipotent, which means he has all power to bring that up to bear. He is omniscient. He knows exactly where we are, where we need to be, and where we're going, and where we've been. And he is omnipresent and all loving. He is the ultimate teacher. Um, Today, we're kind of introducing another non optional aspect of spiritual growth, and I'm going to call it growing pains. You might suggest where that is, and we're going to introduce it tonight. And so I want you to turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to start with the miracle of the loaves. And you'll have to figure it out sort of as we go how that's going to become growing pains. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13, we'll start there. When Jesus heard what had happened, now we have to pause there because what had happened is the death of John the Baptist, the beheading of John the Baptist. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So think about this from Jesus' standpoint. Jesus is grieving because his beloved cousin John the Baptist has been murdered, executed. And so it's picture Jesus getting in a boat by himself and doing the rowing. And that's what happens here. But because of all his miracles, people they're chasing him. They're following him. And that's what happens here. And so a large crowd gathers. They find him and the crowd gathers. And then in verse 15 it says, as evening approached, he has disciples there. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And in verse 17, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, he answered them. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So there may have been 10,000 plus people there. There's a pattern here that you've heard me talk about that follows even in the Lord's Supper, where it says God takes the bread and he thanks God for it first. So you're taken and you are blessed, and then you are broken, and then you are given. And that is true with us about as well as the bread that gives here. So Jesus is the bread of life. He gives us his bread so that it may be given to others, and that's how it operates, and that's how our life operates. And so the broken part is the growing pains that God allows us to have. And that you'll see this here. Now, verse 22 is important as well. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. And if you see a map of the Sea of Galilee, you've got 2 places that are really close by, and we're going to track those. Where the actual miracle of the loaves took place is close to one city, and then the city of Capernaum is very close to that. So you have to just barely cut across the lake to get there, or you could go by land. So immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself. Remember, that was his original intent. He was going to do it in a boat. Now he's doing it by foot. He goes up into a mountain. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. That's important. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Still thinking, no doubt, about John the Baptist and the rest of the disciples. Later that night, he was all alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Interesting, that's a lake, it's the Sea of Galilee. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And Peter says, this is, by the way, only in Matthew, Peter says, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You have little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And then I'll have to read one more verse here. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. This is kind of a 2-part here thing, and one of the parts is pretty small, but I really love it, and I think you will too. And that's the way that the Gospels come together. God gave us 4 Gospels for a good reason, and you're going to see this here. The first thing I want to say is this. Go back to Matthew chapter 14, verse 1. Remember, this is where this all started, is the beheading of John the Baptist. And here's the explanation that Matthew gives. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, that would be his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That's why miraculous powers are at work in him." And then he goes on to say the scenario about how Herod had been arrested and why he was beheaded. But my question here is this: how does Matthew know what Herod is saying to his servants in his court? Does Matthew have specific information? How does Matthew know to this? Or is this just a sort of robotic God knew, and so he told Matthew? I think there's more to it than that. And to find out, I want you to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 8. This is I think it's amazing how God gives us these different gospels here and how much they fit together like pieces of a puzzle. In Lord, I'm going to mark here, Luke chapter 8. All right, verse 1. After this is in a completely different context. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. And here's verse 3. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna and many others. So among Jesus' women's disciples was Joanna. You find Joanna at the cross. You find Joanna at the tomb. You find Joanna telling the disciples that Jesus has risen. So, and we also know that they came from Galilee. So that's where Herod, of course, that's where Herod lived. That's where Herod ruled in Galilee. So Chuza is the chief of all the attendants. And no wonder, how could Matthew know? Well, Joanna's telling him. Joanna's there. Her husband is in charge of of Herod's servants. And so it's amazing to me how the Gospels just fit together like that. The second thing I want to say is about the place. So back to Matthew 14, we talk about the miracle of the loaves, but look to Luke chapter 9. We'll get some added information here. Luke chapter 9, verse 10. And you'll see my heading here, Jesus feeds the 5,000. But verse 10 says, when the apostles returned, after he had sent the apostles out, and they came back rejoicing that they had preached the gospel of the kingdom and cast out demons. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. This is really remarkable. Again, I'm seeing on a daily basis, it feels like, God's work, God's intervention. This morning I was up early and studying, and I looked at a YouTube channel, and guess what? There has been a new archaeological discovery just recently, and guess what they found? They found the town of Bethsaida. Very exactly where it should be. It's a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. And that's exactly where this is here, and they've just now discovered it. Here's what's the neat thing about it is, they also found in that same place a 5th century, I think, Byzantine, 5th or 6th century Byzantine, not a synagogue, but like a cathedral there. And they found an inscription that the place was dedicated to the Apostle Peter. It's amazing, and you can see this on YouTube, by the way. Um, but the point is here, they're on Bethsaida. Now there's something else that we need to know about. Turn to John chapter 6. Same scenario. This is the same. All these are the same event, the feeding of the 5,000, and it's in every gospel. In John chapter 6, it says, the very first part, Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now, let's look at it from John's perspective here. Verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and John says that is the Sea of Tiberias. It was also called that because of Tiberias was a city that was built there for Caesar. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by the healing of the sick. Now, again, Matthew just says the crowd followed him. John tells us exactly why. They saw the miracles. Verse 3, then Jesus went up on a mountain side and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was there. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming to him, he said to Philip, why shall we buy bread for these people? Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than a half year's wages. So you got more details here. It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, and how will they go among so many? How far will they go? Now, here's my question. Why ask Philip? Philip is kind of not a famous disciple. Why would Jesus ask Philip, where shall we go buy bread? Well, I'm going to tell you why here in the scriptures. Turn to John chapter 12. All right, verse 20. John 12:20. Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to, here he is again, Philip. Now watch this, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to go see Jesus. So Philip, again, tells Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Here's the point. Why did Jesus ask Philip? Because that's where he's from. They're in their hometown when he's doing this miracle of the loaves. And it's so neat how the Bible just fits together like pieces of a puzzle. Why did the Greeks come to Philip and ask him? I think it was because it's a Greek name. Philip is one of those disciples that doesn't have another name. You know, you've got Simon the leper, you've got Andrew or John the son of Zebedee, Peter the son of the Cephas has several names. But Philip doesn't have that because his name is rather unique, and he's got a Greek name because he has Greek connections, and that's why the Greeks came to him. But he's from Bethsaida, and that's why this miracle. That's why Jesus asked him, "Where shall we buy food?" I think all that is just great. And that's kind of an apologetic for this. Now, here's the spiritual part of it. Turn to Mark chapter 6. Again, every gospel has this, and Mark does too. But watch this. Same scenario here. Mark chapter 6. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because we've already read that in Matthew. But start in verse 45. Mark chapter 6, verse 45. Again, you can read the whole account in Mark as well as Matthew. In verse 45, it says this, immediately, this is after the feeding of the 5,000, immediately Jesus made his disciples, think about made, in some translations it says Jesus compelled them to get in the boat. Now, I'm not going to take the time for this, but I encourage you to go back and read John chapter 6 too. Here's what happened. Jesus was already a miracle worker, and so people were following him like crazy. And now he feeds 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And John says they think he's got to be the new Moses. And so they're about to make him the king. So here's what Jesus does. First, he compels the disciples, get in the boat, get out of here, because he doesn't want the people to make him the king. And then he sends the crowd away and he goes to a mountain by himself. And later on, he's setting the disciples up for something, and we're going to see this in Mark here. All right, back to verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples that's a strong word, made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to where? Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountain to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars. How could he see the disciples? He's on a mountain there in the middle of the lake. Well, because he's Jesus, of course. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, John says, no, or is it Matthew? I think it's John says this is the fourth watch. The fourth watch is the watch right before dawn. So it's 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So not too long before sunrise, but it's still in the dark. So they're in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the night, and they're in big trouble here with the wind. And so when he, shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought it was a ghost, just like Matthew says. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified, just like Matthew says. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Now, what's missing here, if you find it, I think you have to find it in Matthew, is Peter said, if it's really you, let me walk on the water to you. And that's Matthew's the only one that takes that consideration. But Mark has a different emphasis here. So let's read it. Verse 51. Then he climbed into the boat with them, with Peter, no doubt, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, now watch this, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. That's why Jesus compelled them to get in the boat. That's why Jesus wasn't there. He was there. He saw them struggling in the boat. Think about this. The first thing I want to say about this is why walk on water? Jesus could have just been there. He could have just seen him. That's how it happened after the resurrection. He just shows up miraculously. Why Jesus walk on the water? Think about what he's teaching these disciples here. In Mark chapter 1, if you just and we're not going to go there for all these things. In Mark chapter 1, he quotes Isaiah 43 from the lips of John, but John's quoting Isaiah 43, verse 3. This is the one crying in the wilderness, make straight the ways of the Lord. Jesus. So the deity of Christ is evident in Mark chapter 1, verse 1. A lot of people think that Mark doesn't talk about the deity of Christ. Of course he does, every chapter. Mark chapter 2, what does he do? He forgives the paralytic who lets down through the roof, and the Pharisees freak out about that. Only God can forgive sins. So chapter 1, he's the Lord. Chapter 2, he's God forgiving sins. Now he's walking on the water. You don't have to turn there, but you might want to look at it later. Job chapter 9, verse 8. God alone stretches out the heavens and treads upon the waves of the sea. You see these references? They're implicit. I mean, they're not explicit. They're implicit, but they are in your face, basically, implicit that Jesus is God in the flesh. And so now he's doing what those disciples knew, that only God walks on the water. Jesus walked on the water. Only God forgives sins. Jesus forgave sins. You see this? So he's teaching. He's a determined teacher. He 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 fed 15,000 or 10,000, who we don't know exactly, a lot of people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He is omnipotent, he is omniscient, he is omnipresent, and all those things, and their hearts were hardened. They did not get the fact of who he was when he fed the 5,000 with bread and fish. And so he puts them in the boat. Now they're in trouble. I want to say this, that our spiritual growth is God is so committed to it that he's willing to let us get on the water and have trouble so that he can walk across the water and rescue us. I'm going to finish with Hebrews chapter 12, a pretty good passage here. So let's turn there. Hebrews chapter 12. And you'll see this from the light of what we've been talking about here. I just think it's a wonderful way that the Gospels all work together to teach us this, that Jesus is such a determined teacher. He's gonna do what it takes to help us understand and to be changed into his image. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4. Look at this. Think about spiritual growth. Think about everything you've been learning. First words. In your struggle against sin. Does that sound like spiritual growth? Absolutely. Spiritual growth requires spiritual warfare. We've been saying that. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. And do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardness as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Let's go back to the very beginning. Spiritual growth is not optional. Spiritual growth is not natural. Spiritual growth requires discipline. And spiritual growth requires chastening. Because there are some things that we just cannot learn any other way. This is for me. I'm like everybody else. When something happens, something, I get sick, or a financial loss of some kind, or something happens that I don't want to happen, my first inclination is, oh, brother, why is this happening? And then I start to realize, wait a minute. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. God is omnipresent. He is a determined teacher. God has a hand in virtually everything in our lives. We need to know that. Obviously, it's a partnership between us and God, and things happen that they're just happen, I think. But I think the very first thing we need to do is to look to the Lord in our trials. And that's exactly what it says here. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by the Father? And if we don't have chastening, we are not God's children. If we can just breeze through life, and some people seem to do that, David complained about that in the Psalms. If we can breeze through life like that, we're not God's children. God is a determined teacher, and we have growing pains. And I just think we need to realize that. Then he says in verse 9, moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us and we respected them for it, how much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, here's the so what. What are we going to do with all this? Here's what we do. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, which means if we're going through troubles, do the next right thing. Just trust the Lord with this. You're going to bear it. Yes, it's painful, but we just try to do the next right thing. I can think of several people in my own life that are having to do exactly that. Then verse 13, make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. We have a determined teacher. Sometimes he'll put us out in the middle of the lake and bring a storm to it, but he'll walk on the water to get to us. And that's the sermon for the day. Thanks for watching.